The Hawthorne Gala shimmered with opulence, a spectacle of wealth and excess. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the elegantly dressed guests. Laughter and chatter filled the air, but amid the joyous sounds, Vivian Hawthorne stood apart, her icy gaze sweeping over the crowd. She felt a thrill in the superficiality that surrounded her, a world where appearances mattered more than truth. The glittering scene before her was a carefully crafted illusion, and she reveled in it. As she surveyed the room, her eyes landed on Lucas, a waiter moving through the throng with practiced grace. He carried a tray of champagne flutes, his face a mask of concentration. Vivian could not resist the cruel amusement that stirred within her. "Look at him, hustling like a dog for scraps," she whispered to her friend, her voice dripping with disdain. "Does he think any of this will matter to us?" Unbeknownst to Vivian, Lucas felt the ache in his heart as he worked tirelessly to support his sick mother. Each smile he forced for the guests was a reminder of the struggles he faced. He glanced up, catching Vivian's gaze, and for a fleeting moment, their eyes locked. There was a world of difference between them. She, bathed in luxury, and he, trapped in a cycle of hardship. Yet, in that brief exchange, something flickered in Vivian's expression, a hint of understanding that quickly faded. The gala continued around them, the music swelling, but outside the grand venue, the streets told a different story. Shadows loomed, and the stark contrast between the glimmering chandeliers and the poverty beyond the doors was palpable. Vivian had always been sheltered from the harsh realities of life. She found comfort in her world, where privilege shielded her from the struggles that others endured. But tonight, as she watched Lucas, a shadow crossed her face. For a heartbeat, she felt a spark of empathy, a connection to the pain he carried, yet she quickly suppressed it. It was easier to ignore than to confront. "Vivian, are you even listening?" her friend asked, pulling her back to the chatter of the gala. Vivian forced a smile, nodding as she turned her focus back to the spectacle around her. She could not let the fleeting moment of vulnerability show. "Of course, just admiring the view," she replied, her tone light, masking the turmoil that brewed beneath the surface. She raised her glass, clinking it against her friend's, dismissing the weight of the evening's reality. But as the night wore on, the laughter grew louder and the music more exuberant. Vivian felt a tension building within her. The superficiality that once delighted her now felt suffocating. Her eyes drifted back to Lucas, who was now serving a group of guests, his back straight, his expression focused. His resilience struck a chord deep within her, yet she quickly turned away, pushing the thought aside. "Look at the way he moves," she commented, her voice laced with mockery. "Like he's part of the furniture. How sad." Her friend giggled, unfazed by the edge in Vivian's tone, but inside, Vivian felt a pang of something she could not name. Was it guilt? Compassion? Or was it simply the discomfort of realizing that beneath the surface of her perfect life lay a world she had always chosen to ignore? As the evening reached its peak, Vivian found herself trapped in a cycle of laughter and pretense, yet part of her remained drawn to the stark reality that Lucas embodied. She watched him from a distance, a silent observer in her own life. The divide between them felt insurmountable, yet something within her stirred, hinting that perhaps, just perhaps, the world outside the gala held more meaning than the glittering facade inside. And so, the opulent night continued, each moment a reminder of the choices they had made, the worlds they inhabited, and the invisible threads that tied them together. Would Vivian ever dare to cross that threshold, to step beyond her gilded cage and acknowledge the truth? Only time would tell, but for now, she remained ensconced in her world of wealth, where the shadows outside were nothing more than a fleeting thought. The night air was thick with tension as Lucas stepped out of the bus, the dim streetlights casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. He had just finished his shift at the Hawthorne Gala, the glittering event still fresh in his mind. He couldn't shake off the image of Vivian, her cold smile glimmering under the chandeliers. He thought of his mother at home, her cough echoing through their small apartment, and felt another wave of exhaustion wash over him. As he walked, lost in thought, a screeching noise broke the stillness. Lucas turned just in time to see a car swerving towards him. He barely had time to react before it struck him, sending him tumbling onto the ground. Pain shot through his leg as he struggled to get up. "Hey, are you okay?" a familiar voice called out. It was Vivian, her face illuminated by the headlights of her car. She stepped out, her expression a mix of concern and shock. I think so," Lucas stammered, trying to catch his breath. The pain was sharp, but he forced himself to stand. "What are you doing here?" "I was driving home from the gala. I didn't see you," she said, her eyes wide. "I'm so sorry." Lucas couldn't help but feel a strange mix of anger and relief. "You should pay more attention. People like you don't care about folks like me," he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. Vivian frowned, her brow furrowing. "That's not fair. I didn't mean to hit you," she replied, her tone softening. "Are you sure you're all right?" He hesitated, but then nodded. "I'll live. It's nothing." But the truth was, he felt a rush of vulnerability in her presence, a feeling he rarely allowed himself. Vivian looked at him closely, her icy demeanor cracking for a moment. "I know I can seem distant," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I didn't mean to hurt you. I just don't understand." Lucas crossed his arms, his heart pounding. "Understand what? The life you live? The privilege you have?" He took a step closer, the frustration boiling inside him. "You have no idea what it's like to struggle. My father was kicked out of your family's estate without a reason, while you all sit in your fancy halls, laughing and celebrating." Vivian's face paled. I didn't know," she stammered, her eyes suddenly filled with understanding. "What happened?" "He worked hard for your family, and they tossed him aside like trash," Lucas said, his voice rising. "He lost everything because of your family's decisions." Vivian felt a pang of guilt strike her. She had always been taught to believe that her family was above reproach. The thought of her father's name being linked to such cruelty rattled her. "I didn't know any of this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course you didn't," Lucas replied, his frustration melting into something softer. "You're too busy living in your bubble." Silence hung between them, thick and heavy. Vivian glanced away, her mind racing. The lavish gala, the laughter, the joy, all felt hollow now. "I need to know more," she said, her resolve hardening. "I want to understand." Lucas raised an eyebrow, surprised by her sincerity. "Why now? Why do you care?" "Because I don't want to be part of something that causes pain," she replied, her voice trembling with emotion. "I want to make it right." Lucas studied her for a moment, searching her face for any sign of deceit, but all he saw was a girl wrestling with her own privilege. "You can't just decide to change everything overnight," he said. "It's not that easy." "I know," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But I have to try. I owe it to you, to your father." As they stood there under the glowing streetlights, an unspoken bond began to form. Lucas felt a flicker of hope, while Vivian grappled with the weight of her family's legacy. In that moment, they both realized that the road ahead would not be easy, but it was a journey worth taking. "Let's talk more," Lucas said, his voice steadying. "You want to understand? Then let's start here." Vivian nodded, determination shining in her eyes. Together, they would face the truth, each step pulling them closer to understanding the worlds they inhabited. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft light through the large windows of the Hawthorne mansion. Vivian sat at the edge of her bed, her mind swirling with thoughts. The events from the gala weighed heavily on her heart. She had always known about her family's wealth, but now she felt the chains of guilt binding her. "Why didn't I see it before?" she whispered to herself, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The girl looking back at her seemed foreign, a stranger wrapped in silk and diamonds. She recalled Lucas's words, The pain in his voice when he spoke of his father's dismissal. It echoed in her mind, stirring something deep within her. With a determined sigh, she rose and dressed, her movements mechanical. She needed answers. Vivian walked down the grand staircase, its marble steps cool against her bare feet. The house felt empty, the silence pressing down on her. She found her mother, Margaret, in the kitchen, sipping coffee while reading the morning news. "Mom," Vivian said, her voice shaky but resolute. "We need to talk." Margaret looked up, surprise flickering across her face. "About what, dear?" she asked, a hint of caution in her tone. "About our family, about what Dad did to the community," Vivian replied, her heart racing. "I can't just ignore it anymore." Margaret frowned, setting her cup down. "Vivian, we have always done what was best for our family, you know that." "But at what cost?" Vivian pressed, her emotions bubbling to the surface. "People lost their jobs, their homes, all for our wealth." Margaret's expression hardened. "You don't understand the world we live in. These things are complicated." "Complicated?" Vivian echoed, eyes narrowing. "These are real people with real lives. You can't just brush it off as complicated." Margaret stood, the tension in the room thickening. "You are being naive. This is how society works. We have to maintain our status." Vivian felt a wave of frustration. "And at the expense of others? I refuse to accept that. I want to know the truth about our family's legacy." Margaret's face turned icy. "You are being dramatic, Vivian. You need to focus on your future, not on the past." But Vivian was no longer the young girl who accepted her mother's words without question. "I need to understand, Mom. If I want to move forward, I have to confront our history." The conversation hung between them, charged with unspoken fears. Vivian turned away, her heart racing. She needed to see for herself the impact of her father's actions. She grabbed her coat and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" her mother called, but Vivian did not answer. The air was heavy with tension as she stepped outside. The drive to the community her father had helped destroy felt surreal. Each passing block reminded her of the opulence she lived in, a stark contrast to the faded buildings and weary faces she was about to see. As she parked the car and stepped out, the noise of the bustling streets invaded her senses. Children played with worn toys, and mothers carried bags filled with groceries, their faces etched with worry. Vivian wandered deeper into the neighborhood, her heart aching as she recognized the remnants of her father's legacy. She stopped at a small park where a group of children played. They laughed, but the joy felt bittersweet against the backdrop of crumbling homes. "Excuse me," she said to a woman sitting on a nearby bench, her face weathered but kind. "Can you tell me about this place?" The woman looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly. "This used to be a thriving community, but after the Hawthorne factory closed, everything changed. People lost their jobs. It's been tough." Vivian's chest tightened. "I didn't know. I'm sorry." The woman studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You're one of them, aren't you? One of the Hawthorns?" Vivian swallowed hard, feeling a mix of shame and anger. "Yes, but I want to help. I need to understand what happened." "You can't change the past," the woman replied softly. "But you can make a difference now. That's what matters." Vivian nodded, the weight of her family's history pressing down on her. In that moment, she felt a connection to the woman, to the community. It was a bond forged in shared pain, and it ignited a spark within her. "I want to change things," she said, determination filling her voice. As she walked away from the park, Vivian thought of Lucas. They both carried the burden of their family's actions, but perhaps together they could find a way to make things right. The thought of his understanding eyes brought her comfort, and she felt the first stirrings of hope in her heart. The grand dining room of the Hawthorne mansion glimmered under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. Vivian sat at the long table, surrounded by the familiar faces of her family. The air was thick with tension, and the clinking of silverware echoed in the silence. Tonight, she felt a storm brewing inside her, a mix of fear and determination. "Vivian, dear, you seem awfully quiet," her mother, Margaret, said, her voice cutting through the uneasy atmosphere. "Is everything all right?" Vivian looked up, her heart racing. "No, it's not," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt heavy on her tongue, but she pressed on. "We need to talk about our family's past." Margaret's expression shifted, and Vivian could see the flicker of annoyance in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "There's nothing to discuss. Our family has always been respected in this community." "But at what cost?" Vivian challenged, her voice rising. "People are suffering because of what our family has done. Don't you see that?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Vivian, their surprise palpable. Margaret's face hardened, and she leaned forward, her tone icy. "You are being dramatic. This is not the time or place for such talk." Vivian could feel the weight of her family's expectations pressing down on her. "No, Mother, it is the time. I can't ignore it anymore. The workers who built this mansion, the families who lost their homes, all because of our wealth. I want to make it right." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "You have no idea what you are talking about. You are young and naive. Our family's success is built on hard work and determination." "Hard work or exploitation?" Vivian shot back, her cheeks flushed with anger. "I spoke to Lucas. He told me about his father's dismissal. That man worked for our family for years. How can you justify that?" "Lucas," Margaret scoffed. "Why are you listening to a waiter? He does not understand our world." Vivian's heart sank, but she stood her ground. "He understands more than you think. He has seen the impact of our actions. I refuse to be part of this denial any longer." Margaret's face turned pale, and she slammed her hand on the table. "Enough. This conversation is over. You are not going to embarrass our family with your reckless ideas." Vivian felt a rush of sadness wash over her. "I'm not trying to embarrass you, Mother. I'm trying to find a way to help, to change." Margaret shook her head. "You are just a child playing with ideas you cannot comprehend. You will regret this." As the argument hung in the air, Vivian felt a moment of clarity pierce through her turmoil. She realized that she could no longer hide behind her family's wealth and reputation. It was time to use her voice for change, starting with her mother's denial of their legacy. Later that evening, as she sat in her room, the weight of the confrontation pressed heavily on her heart. She picked up her phone and texted Lucas, hoping he would respond. "I talked to my mother. It didn't go well." A moment later, her phone buzzed. "I'm here for you, Vivian. You're brave for speaking up. Don't let her silence you." His words ignited a spark within her. Lucas's encouragement reminded her that she was not alone in this fight. She took a deep breath, feeling the fear begin to lift. "Thank you, Lucas. I want to do more. I want to help those who have suffered because of our family." "Then do it. Use your platform," Lucas replied. "You have a chance to make a difference. Don't waste it." Vivian smiled, a newfound determination surging through her. She knew she had to step outside her comfort zone, to challenge the very foundations of her privileged life. But it was not just about changing her family's legacy. It was about seeking redemption for the pain they had caused. As she lay in bed that night, the shadows of doubt still lingered. The emotional toll of her choices weighed heavily on her. She felt torn between the life she had always known and the path she yearned to embrace. But deep down, she knew she was ready to fight for what was right. She was ready to change. Vivian stood at the edge of the park, a clipboard in hand, her heart racing with a mix of excitement and dread. She had spent weeks organizing a community event to support those affected by her family's past. As she looked around, she saw familiar faces. Some were smiling, while others carried a weight of suspicion. They were all there, but not everyone was supportive. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" whispered Claire, Vivian's childhood friend, who had come with her, arms crossed tightly. "Your family won't like this." Vivian took a deep breath, pushing back the uncertainty that threatened to overwhelm her. "I have to do this, Claire. I can't just sit back anymore." I need to try to make things right." Claire frowned but nodded. "Just be careful. Your mother is not going to let this go easily." As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the gathering, Lucas arrived, his presence calming her nerves. He approached her with a smile that made her heart flutter. "You're really doing it, aren't you?" he said, glancing at the crowd. "I have to," Vivian replied, her voice steady. "I need to stand up for what's right. This is my chance to help." Lucas nodded, his dark eyes reflecting understanding. "You're brave, Vivian. Just remember, you're not alone in this." The event started with small conversations and introductions. Vivian could feel the tension in the air, especially when some of her family members showed up, their expressions a mix of disbelief and disdain. Her mother, Margaret, stood with her arms crossed, a disapproving frown on her face. "Vivian," Margaret called out, stepping closer, "what on earth do you think you're doing? This is not how we handle things." Vivian felt her heart race. She took a step forward, determined. "Mom, I can't ignore what our family has done any longer. These people deserve support and respect." Margaret huffed. "You think you can change the world with a few speeches? This is our legacy." "Don't you see?" Vivian snapped back, her voice rising. "Our legacy is built on pain. I want to change that." Lucas placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "Vivian, focus on your speech. You've prepared for this." With a nod, Vivian turned to the crowd. Swallowing her fear, she stepped up to the microphone. The chatter faded, and all eyes were on her. She took a deep breath, looking out at the faces she wanted to help. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "I know that my family's past is filled with hurt and exploitation. I cannot change what has happened, but I stand here today to say that I want to help." The crowd listened intently, some nodding in agreement. She felt Lucas's supportive gaze behind her, giving her strength. "I am organizing efforts to support this community and those affected by my family's actions. I want to listen to your stories and work together for change," Vivian continued, her voice growing stronger. After she finished her speech, a mix of applause and murmurs filled the air. Some faces were warm and supportive, but others were cold and unwelcoming. Vivian's heart sank as she caught sight of her mother's scowl. "What have you done?" Margaret hissed, stepping closer again. "You have embarrassed us in front of everyone." "I have to do what's right," Vivian said, her voice firm. "If you can't understand that, then maybe you don't know me at all." Lucas stepped in, looking at Margaret with a calm but serious expression. "Vivian is trying to make amends. Your family's past is part of who she is, but she wants to change that for the better." Margaret's expression hardened. "You think a few words will erase generations of privilege? Think again." Vivian felt a wave of doubt wash over her, but she pushed it aside. "I won't stop, Mom. I will fight for what's right, no matter the cost." As the event continued, conversations buzzed around her. Some people approached Vivian, expressing their gratitude for her efforts. Others, however, whispered behind her back, their words sharp and cutting. "Look at her, trying to play the hero," one woman sneered, but Vivian kept her chin up, knowing that this was just the beginning. She looked over at Lucas, who smiled back at her, and in that moment, she realized she was not alone. She was ready to face whatever backlash came her way, determined to change the narrative of her family's legacy, one step at a time. The charity gala was a grand affair, filled with the kind of elegance that only the Hawthorne name could bring. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the crowd, but Vivian felt a chill in the air as she entered the room. This was not just another event for her, it was a moment of truth. Her heart raced with both anticipation and dread. As she walked through the room, Vivian could feel the weight of her family's legacy pressing down on her. She looked at the familiar faces, the wealthy and powerful, and wondered how many of them were aware of the suffering their privilege had caused. The thought made her stomach turn. She spotted her mother, Margaret, across the room, her posture rigid and proud, a queen surveying her kingdom. Vivian knew this night would change everything. "Vivian, darling," Margaret called, her voice smooth like silk but laced with an edge. You look stunning. We must keep up appearances. Vivian forced a smile. Thank you, Mother. I have something important I need to say tonight. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Is it about the charity? We do need to impress our donors. It's about more than that, Vivian replied, her voice steady, but her heart pounding. It's about our family and what we've done. Margaret's smile faltered, replaced with a frown. Don't make a scene, Vivian. We are here to raise money, not to air out dirty laundry. But Vivian could no longer ignore the truth. She took a deep breath, her mind flashing back to all the moments that had led her here. She remembered the faces of those who had suffered because of her family's actions. Lucas's words echoed in her mind, the pain he had shared with her, the stories that had haunted him. As the evening wore on, Vivian found herself at the podium, her heart racing. She looked out at the crowd, her gaze settling on Lucas, who stood at the back, encouraging her with a nod. She could see the hope in his eyes, and it gave her the strength she needed. Thank you all for being here tonight, she began, her voice trembling but growing stronger with each word. Tonight, I want to address something that has weighed heavily on my heart. My family's wealth comes with a dark history. We have harmed many lives, and it is time for me to acknowledge that. A hush fell over the room. Whispers spread like wildfire, and Vivian could feel their judgment. But she pressed on, her determination fueling her. I cannot stand here and pretend that everything is fine. My father's decisions have hurt many. I want to change that. Margaret's face turned pale, and Vivian saw her mother's eyes narrow. This is not the time, Vivian, she hissed from the side of the stage. Ignoring her mother's protests, Vivian continued. I am committed to making amends. I want to help the community that my family has neglected for too long. We can do better. The words poured out of her, raw and real. As she finished speaking, the room was silent. For a moment, Vivian feared she had made a grave mistake, but then, one by one, people began to clap. The sound grew louder, filling the hall with a wave of support. Tears pricked Vivian's eyes as she felt the warmth of acceptance. Margaret stepped forward, her expression torn. Vivian, you are bringing shame to our name, she said, her voice low but fierce. This is not how we do things. Vivian took a step closer to her mother. No, Mother. This is how we change things. We can't hide from our past anymore. Margaret's eyes softened for a moment, and Vivian saw a flicker of understanding. I just wanted to protect you, she whispered. I know, but I need to find my own path, Vivian said, her voice filled with emotion. We can still be a family, but we must face the truth together. In that moment, their eyes locked, and a bittersweet reconciliation took place. Both women stood vulnerable, facing their fears and hopes for the future. Later that evening, as the gala began to wind down, Vivian found Lucas waiting for her outside. She stepped into the cool night air, her heart lighter than before. You did it, he said, pride shining in his eyes. You spoke your truth. I couldn't have done it without you, Vivian replied, a smile breaking through her earlier tension. Thank you for believing in me. Together, they looked out at the community gathered nearby, a blend of faces that had once seemed so distant. Vivian understood now that true wealth lay not in the glittering chandeliers of her family's mansion, but in the bonds they forged with those around them. With Lucas by her side, she felt ready to embrace her new path, one built on empathy, connection, and the courage to change. Share this story if you believe that facing the truth can lead to real change and healing. Leave a comment about a moment when you stood up for what you believe in and how it impacted your life. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this one.